So I've like been following your tweets a bit and your story about open source software and open source software capital. And I don't know, besides what I've seen in the tweets, I'd love to sort of hear it from you, because you've started this venture firm. Was it 2018? I think I read. Yep. And yeah, I'd love to hear just kind of the story of how you decided that this was the focus you wanted to give. Was that something you'd been doing before 2018? And sort of how did you decide to focus on this as a venture capital kind of vertical?
Yeah, so I started OSS Capital in September 2018 after blogging about open source startups for a few years. I was obsessed in a very unhealthy way with open source companies.
Yeah.
And I am I'm a bit weird of a person. I can be sort of linguistically precise and sensitive sometimes. So I frankly just got very annoyed with the way venture capitalists were sort of using the phrase open source in harmful ways, or sort of inappropriate ways, sort of saying, this is an open source company, or this is an open source business model, and so on and so forth. Yeah. And while that might actually sound on the surface a little weird and crazy, I can unpack it a little bit, because that's actually the origin story behind everything. There's a few origin stories, kind of like why I started to do this, but that's like one of the main ones. And I can kind of talk about some of the others as well, but like, the main one was really this like linguistic annoyance, sort of like semantic annoyance, sort of what the hell do other people think this means? It actually doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean what they think it means. And that's a sort of like a poker tell that they have no idea what they're talking about.
Right.
And not that I do, right? I'm less wrong. I'm not a huge fan of the less wrong blog, by the way. I think there's a lot of good content on it, but I think the underpinnings are actually quite flawed. That is a completely different conversation. We can have it some other time.
Right.
I would prefer to not have that conversation.
Sure.
Open source means something really specific. It means that you are granting a set of sort of almost like unalienable rights to a piece of source code, kind of in the same way that the Declaration of Independence in the United States gives people the right to have freedom of speech and types of fundamental rights.
Yep.
And it's like a really critical, important thing. Obviously, this guy Richard Stallman kind of came up with it after being really pissed off about Unix and Microsoft.
Right.
In the early 80s at of all things, the MIT CSAIL lab at the time, which is where object-oriented programming was invented and public key cryptography was invented, and a lot of these other things came out of MIT CSAIL in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. One of them was free software. And so Richard Stallman, in his pissed off angst against Unix and Microsoft, said, what the fuck are these people doing? Copywriting source code.
Yeah.
That's fucking evil. I'm going to create something called copyleft.
Right.
The opposite of copyright. Ha ha. Yep. And in his brilliance, he came up with, obviously, the GNU toolchain, which is a huge part of Linux. Obviously, Emacs, which is kind of, for the people who are the, RMS sort of, maybe not zealots, but sort of mega fans and sort of more purists about different sort of things, programming related. They're sort of maybe they default to Emacs over Vim and other editors. But let's just say, Richard was the founding father of open source, and it was overly ideologically motivated in the beginning for the first 15 years in particular, from 1983 to 1998. And that period of time, frankly, free software was like really fringe and sort of like a hobbyist type of movement, and people were sort of more ideologically and sort of philosophically attracted to that movement.
And there was a lot of it, if I recall, it was kind of on like diskette trading and stuff, right? Like there weren't a lot of networks trading.
Yeah, I don't even think Usenet was around. I think it was like pre-Usenet.
Right.
if I'm not mistaken.
Was there any hint from any of his writing that kind of indicates why he became a zealot, or sort of how he came to the conclusion that this?
Just pissed off. I think being frustrated and angry is a really valid and powerful, motivating, sort of
pissed off at what?
Force. Oh no! So he was like specifically like I said, Unix and Microsoft were sort of becoming dominant.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it was explicitly Bill Gates, but like sort of the public letter to hobbyists that Bill wrote in 1973, which was a decade before Richard came up with free software. At least published it. He was probably thinking about it for a good part of that decade, I imagine. Yeah. But it was pretty clear that like Microsoft was on the ascendance, and Unix was obviously the dominant operating system, very proprietary.
Yep.
And my take is that Richard was pissed off and was like, fuck this.
Yeah.
Here's a solution.
Yep.
Right. And his solution was copyleft as far as the license framework. So he really kind of invented a few fundamental things. Like these are fundamental things that he came up with. The sort of not the kernel, that was Linus, but sort of the GNU parts of Linux. A lot of user space things, and then obviously the free software manifesto, and then the license model, the GPL. He invented the GPL, and then he invented this sort of philosophy, this kind of like a church of thought.
Yep.
And really kind of like a cult. It was kind of a cult. He invented a cult. And his sort of mechanism for doing that was both linguistic, philosophical, architectural, sort of like very interdisciplinary across all these different sort of spectrums. And as most brilliant things are, it was sort of relegated in obscurity in terms of sort of the very niche hacker community, because it didn't quite have the sort of like layer of abstraction to kind of properly distribute it equally across all of humanity. Until the internet happened. And so the internet happened, and there was some more huge software companies starting to sprout up. Red Hat was one of them. And Red Hat was really this kind of shining example of, wait, you can actually build a huge business on this notion of giving everything away for free.
Yeah.
That's pretty impressive. Right?
Yeah.
And, so that company went from, zero in 1993. Interesting factoid. March 26th or 27th, I think, I have to double check this, is the 30th year anniversary of Red Hat's founding.
Oh, wow.
And, I'm hugely honored and privileged to be good friends with one of the main founders of Red Hat, this gentleman by the name of Bob Young, who lives in New York and different places. And he's just a fantastic, awesome human being, a Canadian guy. Anyways, I'll kind of get back to some of the history, but, free software was very ideologically motivated, and Richard feels that, he's still alive. So I can't speak about it in the past tense. He's still living and breathing on this earth. But he believes that proprietary software is morally wrong and evil. Okay. Yeah. So if you use or are used, he came up with this really cute word called the useds. Right? So people who use proprietary software are not users of the software.
Right.
They're the users. Meaning the software is controlling you.
Yep.
You are not controlling the software.
Yeah.
Because you can't see the source code and you can't change the source code and so on and so forth, which is kind of like an elitist perspective to have, because vast majority of people aren't great programmers. So there's all kinds of flaws in this argument. As brilliant as Richard is, he has a lot of kind of cognitive flaws in his overall philosophy. But let's just kind of speed up a little bit. So in 1998, a group of people, Christine Peterson, Larry Augustin, Bruce Perens, a handful of others, came up with the term open source. And the term open source was coined to basically sort of untangle all of the sort of philosophical elements that were sort of very ideologically motivated from free software, and just make open source more pragmatic, or sort of make free software more pragmatic. And so it was a rebranding exercise. Let's change the name from free software. Right. Let's call it open source. And
but while that transition was happening, were there other things that were like, it sounds like the Stallman thing was a very extreme view.
Yes.
And then there's probably something in the middle. And I wonder if, like, in the rebranding, were there also some more moderate ideas that were being surfaced, or was it purely like, I'm not an expert at all this stuff, but I understand there's like GPL and the GNU stuff, and then there's like the MIT licenses, and then there's different amounts of like restrictive or unrestrictive. Was any of that coming to head with the introduction of that open source term?
As far as I know, you really only had the GPL license, and the MIT license for that first period of time, from 83 to the late 90s.
Got it. Mm-hmm.
I think Apache surfaced somewhere in there as well. Like Apache Software Foundation may have been founded in the 90s. I'm not 100% sure. I'm going to Google it now. Was the Apache Software Foundation created? I know the guy who helped start it. His name is Brian Bellendorf. Oh, yeah, 99. Okay, so that's much later. Much, much later.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd actually say there were really only two licenses that were sort of like implementing these ideas. The GPL and then the MIT license.
And you were talking about the rebrand that happened. Was any of that rebrand part of like centrism and ideology from where Stallman was, or that wasn't really part of the rebrand?
I think it was a little bit different. I think those two things are slightly sort of disconnected. So there was really this kind of groundswelling of interest in taking these ideas and sort of democratizing them further. Mm-hmm. But the problem that a handful of very smart people recognized, and this is written down in history and very well documented, so I'm not pulling shit out of my ass here, not to be too crass. We can bleep any of this out, by the way. I tend to get a little bit
it's all right.
Expletive full on not a huge amount of sleep, so I didn't get a ton of sleep last night. So, but I would say the group of people that came together that really wanted to rebrand free software and call it open source, and then carry forward kind of a new banner, if you will, a new flag, were really motivated by the rise of the internet and the rise of sort of the appreciation that this approach to building technology is fundamentally better and is fundamentally good for the world. Mm-hmm. And it produces higher quality software. It speeds the rate of innovation. In Eric Raymond's kind of words, all bugs are shallow with a lot of eyeballs on them. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, and so on and so forth. Right. And so those ideas were sort of like taken to heart by a handful of really kind of pivotal, instrumental people. Tim O'Reilly, Larry Augustin, Bruce Perrins, Christine Peterson, these are some pretty awesome people that are actually all still alive and doing awesome things. Bruce Perrins is actually an early partner of ours at OSS Capital. And Larry Augustin is also one of our partners at OSS Capital. And I've never met Christine Peterson or Tim O'Reilly, but there's some people that we do know that were part of that. That sort of that critical pivotal turning point in the history of open source. And so they branded it as open source, and then I don't really think we saw like a fractioning of like, there's the free software people and then there's the open source people. I think that they've always been like, that's why you see this acronym FOSS, FOSS. Let's just blend the worlds together. We don't want to be so divisive as to say the free software people are like lesser than and the open source people are more than, that's all kind of bullshit. But frankly, I think we have seen a pretty significant chunk of the technology industry really sort of like settle on it's open source. open source works. We understand open source, and it's open source. You kind of have to peel back the layers of the onion a little bit in the tech industry to sort of identify the people who are like, actually, no, it's free software. Free software, right? And so that kind of like dynamic is still there. I would say the free software ecosystem and community is the loud minority, right? Whereas the open source community is really the normal volume, vast majority.
And is that kind of where you identify yourself? Because your entity is OSS Capital, not OSS Capital.
You know,
is that ever, or COSS?
David,
I see.
This is a very good question. I am actually extremely, very much so in the free software camp. And I don't know if I should even really say that too loudly. But
is it just too political of a?
No, that's who I am. I think it is a little political, frankly, but like, I think both approaches have huge merits, and there's really a ton of value in understanding the underpinnings of both things. And it's like really, really critical and profound stuff, right? But I would say we would not be here without Richard Stallman. We would not be here without his brilliance and what he invented and you know, maybe some would say arguably discovered. Right? But I would have to say that, you know, we're standing on the shoulders of this guy who came up with this stuff. And the four freedoms, right? Like the four freedoms are very fundamental. Like, you know, I would put them up there with I don't want to get myself in trouble. I would put them up there with, like, you know, some physics level, you know, laws.
So things like gravity or energy and stuff like that.
I would put them close to certain things like that. Yeah.
Well, and can you outline the four?
So the four freedoms are basically freedom 0, 1, 2, and 3. So Richard started at 0, like all good computer scientists. Yeah. And it's basically the freedom to see. I always find this kind of interesting. My own interpretation is a little bit different than the explicit association that Richard sort of tied free software to source code with, right? So like these ideas are very much sort of source code oriented. I actually believe the four freedoms are much more sort of substrate independent is one way of thinking about it, or sort of like abstraction agnostic almost. That sounds like a little redundant. I think that you could apply the principles of the four freedoms to source code, to atoms, to you know, designs of all kinds, to data. I think you can apply them to neural network weights, for example, which is a popular conversation we're having these days, and a lot of other things. But basically, the four freedoms are the freedom to do what you want with the technology at any time, the freedom to change the technology at any time, and the freedom to see and read the design and the implementation details in entirety of the technology at any time. And then also the freedom to distribute and share, you know, that technology at any time in its original form, or even with your own changes and modifications. Those are the four freedoms, basically. And you know, people have different interpretations. People have like sort of like, this is only about source code. And like I personally, when I learned about open source, and I'm a programmer, I'm a pretty technical person, right? I don't code a lot, but I invest in open source projects. And I read the code and I play with the projects, and I'm pretty, you know, incentivized to do that, so I don't make stupid decisions with people's money. For sure. It's not my money. But you know, I would say that you know, the four freedoms are very much transcendent beyond source code and actually applicable to many other things in life and in the world.
So I'm trying to imagine, like, what are those, like with the design of a toaster, refrigerator, a car, those should also have the four freedoms?
Absolutely.
And how would that look? Like if we were to just really try to chase an example, like if a toaster were to have those 4 freedoms, it still needs to be made of atoms. So somebody has to be responsible, like made and distributed to my house, because I don't want to be in the toaster making business, or even spend my time making a toaster. So like, is there a model for how we should think about enabling toasters with the 4 freedoms while incentivizing somebody to build it and ship it and sell it to me and kind of determine a good market price for that?
Your example sounds crazy today. It's going to sound very familiar and valid and interesting, probably within the next 50 years.
Oh yeah, I actually suspect I'm more on your side with that than not, meaning like I squint and it feels like that to me, but I don't spend enough time to have any hypothesis around how that would play out. So I wonder if you could give a little more color to like,
well, I would be speculating intensely. All I really spend most of my time on is software.
Okay.
Because I'm a software person.
Yep.
I definitely do see a world where this thing is all open source.
When you say this thing, you mean a mobile phone or you mean an Apple iPhone?
I was holding up the iPhone and,
right,
spinning it around for the camera.
For
people just listening to this over audio. I see a world where all physical things are imbued with the same rights as source code in terms of open source licensing.
Yeah.
We haven't yet invented licenses that can accommodate for that, though. So what I mean by that is if you look at the parlance of free software and open source licenses, they've all been tailor-made and designed primarily by lawyers to implement these rights specifically for software source code, that is computer programming language based symbolic systems that distill, natural, Bacchus-Nor form, right? Translation of English and instruction sets down to what the computer can understand as a set of, behavior and actions that need to occur with, transistors going, and doing, bit flipping operations. In the world of physical things, it looks a little bit different. The substrates for computing are different. The design mechanics are different. The way you can actually make things malleable and modify and change them is quite different. So we have to actually take the fundamental principles of these 4 freedoms, right, going back to Richard's stuff, and implement a new set of licenses basically that encapsulate those freedoms and can apply them to different domains. The most interesting domain that I'm thinking quite a lot about is applying these 4 freedoms to neural network weights and parameters in the neurons that basically represent data as you train the neural networks on large amounts of data. And my friend Naval Ravikant tweeted about this a few days ago. We need a copyleft license for data and for the data that gets trained inside of neural networks. And I think he's right. And it's a big, ambitious project. And my partner, Heather Meeker, is making some progress on it. And I've been collaborating with her a little bit. But we have so many projects that we're working on. And so we're like inching forward and making a little bit of progress every day on this. But this is like a big area of interest.
Yeah, I'm trying to get a mental model for like where we are today and take one step beyond. So, I think you had this tweet the other day where you said, "What should be open source that is not?" Yeah. And I replied to it and I said, "Space travel."
And I thought you were joking. You should elaborate on this. What does that mean?
I was actually not joking at all. What I'm saying is, like, you're saying maybe the toaster example is 50 years out. So I'd say maybe the space travel example is actually 100 years. I don't really have a hypothesis on time frame.
Sure.
But I'm trying to say, like, how can we look as far forward as like the most ridiculous thing that like is least likely to be open, or the last bastion of closed source? Sure. Maybe that kind of thing. And so can we try to understand what that might look like and then back it off? And so I think the toaster's closer than that, like by a long shot. And the toaster's still far compared to maybe like an open source protocol or a pure software thing. But like I'm trying to paint a little bit of the picture. It doesn't have to even get to the toaster, but like a little bit further than where we are. Like, what are the next kind of dominoes to tumble?
I really loved the responses to this tweet I put out, and I'm going to just like look at them.
Yeah, share some of your favorites. We'd love to talk about it. Yeah,
I just scan through them and tell you some of my favorites.
I like the question a lot.
Someone responded with, money. And I was like, oh, you mean Atom Coin? Because we have Bitcoin, but do we have Atom Coin? You know, the world of atoms. I was trying to be cute. Someone said ISO standards, and then I was like, ooh, how about Icon? The
standards body for
internet? for the web domain, domain space and all the TLDs and all of that jazz. That's not my idea, by the way. That was my friend Paul Semensky's idea, who's the head of corp dev for Automatic, the WordPress company.
Yep.
I would say a few other ones that are super interesting that jumped out on this thread are standard legal contracts. That's a good one. Someone said SQL. SQL's already open source. Okay. A bunch of people said OpenAI.
Right.
That's a good one. Someone said Google.
And that's one, my understanding actually is that OpenAI was intended to be much more open than it has trended toward. Is that right? I think I've seen some headlines that Elon Musk is starting a OpenAI competitor that's supposed to be more aligned with the original.
It's even funnier than that, David. Elon tweeted the other day, he was like, I named OpenAI because it was supposed to be open source AI.
Right.
And Sam, in his capitalist, crazed intensity, did a 180 and made everything proprietary. Or they still open source a lot of stuff, but the foundation models are all proprietary because Sam's like, we're going to be existentially wiped out and we have to hold this stuff back and it's scary. Elon kind of believes that too. So it's a very nuanced conversation. One thing that I find very fascinating is Elon's like a genius, but he changes his mind in public frequently, which I find very cool, actually.
Yeah.
A lot of people criticize him for that and beat him up. And look, people have the right to change their minds, right? What's the problem?
For sure. And I think it's actually more valuable to reserve the right to change your mind than to say, I'm only going to speak on this once I have the final answer, because the process itself is valuable for forming discovery and getting more feedback on it. That's actually why I call my YouTube channel Curious DK, because it's I'm I don't know, I'm a student of everything. I don't really know anything. So tell me what, I'm curious about it. Let's talk about it. Right. But I don't approach it saying I have all the answers.
I feel the same. I just pasted the tweet that Elon did.
This is in let me pull up the chat here.
February 17th at 1:36 a.m. Pacific time.
Yep.
I wonder what he was doing then. He said, OpenAI was created as an open source, parentheses, which is why I named it, quote unquote, open, unquote, AI, end parentheses, non-profit company to serve as a counterweight to Google. But now it has become a closed source, max profit seeking company, effectively controlled by Microsoft. New paragraph, or new sentence. Not what I intended at all. And then this tweet has 13 million views, 12,000 retweets, 140,000 likes. Everything Elon tweets has a shitload of response and activity because he has 130 million Twitter followers. But anyways, I found it very cool and fascinating that he said that. He was one of the, probably one of the first 5 people that founded OpenAI. Yeah. There's 20 founders of OpenAI right now. It's I founded OpenAI. It's Reid Hoffman and there's all these people. I think Elon was actually the guy who actually did name it. He named it. And his tweet here, illustrates that. So I was support stability in my response. And I think he actually may have met Emad recently. By the time you publish this podcast, that'll be done. Maybe public information. Or maybe it doesn't matter, but I think he's a fan of stability, and I think he's a fan of Stable Diffusion and all the open source models that are coming out. When I say open source, I mean kind of in air quotes. We haven't yet figured out how to actually open source these foundation models because the licenses are actually ethical use, meaning you can't generate child porn and revenge porn, illegal, horrible things you can't do with image gen models in particular, the generative image gen models, have these constraints. The language models may or may not. Literally last week, Jan LeCun's team at Facebook Meta released Llama, which is a 60 plus billion parameter model, and going up against ChatGPT, and someone torrented the weights.
Ooh.
Someone put a pull request in the repo and said, you can fill out this form and wait for our approval, or you can just download the weights on BitTorrent. Here's the link. And it's a 200 gigabyte file, so like people are downloading this thing like left and right. It's got tons of seeds out there and everything. So, anyways, that's actually quite illegal. Well, no, someone trained this. No, not someone. Facebook trained the model.
Yep.
On a ton of data, not just Facebook data, but like a lot of the internet and stuff, and
but basically made the capital investment to do the thing, to own the output.
And they wanted to give it away because the Llama paper has this open source license applied to it. So it's like a copyleft license, but it's only for non-commercial use, which technically really not an open source license. And but it's only meant for researchers. And
so you would say an open source license has to be available kind of without any restrictions, or?
Well, open source means, again, going back to something I said in the very early parts of this conversation, open source means something very specific. You cannot change the definition, period. I'm sorry. Right.
You cannot change the definition of
There's a lot of people that disagree with me.
Okay.
You are not allowed to change the definition of open source. I'm sorry. That's not okay. A lot of people disagree with me. Most VCs think I'm totally crazy, and they very strongly disagree with me. A lot of founders disagree with me, actually. The challenge right now we have in the industry is we're starting to sort of use the term open source or open in sort of fuzzy, happy, interchangeable kind of ways. It's like, oh, it's open, it's fine.
Right.
And it's not actually open source. And this is extremely toxic and damaging, in my opinion. That is not the same as saying proprietary software is evil. I use proprietary software all the time. I'm an iPhone user. Again, for the people who are only listening, I'm holding up my iPhone. The most proprietary consumer product ever invented.
Right.
I am a fan of a lot of proprietary technology. I own a Tesla, right? I like Elon's cars. I'm a big fan of Elon's cars. Yep. Very proprietary technology, right? Except for his gesture of open sourcing the access to the charging stations, which is a kind of open source gesture, but not really. I'm not saying that proprietary software is bad, but open source is a very specific thing. It means something specific. And so when you say I'm going to open source my technology, you have to actually do it. And frankly, even though I'm an early investor in Stability, I'm a big fan of what Emad is doing. I'm a huge fan of the movement towards truly open source, AI. Quite frankly, to being blunt and direct about it, it doesn't exist right now. Right now, it doesn't exist yet. Some people Well, we don't have open source licenses for neural network weights. That's what does not yet exist. What people are doing today is they're sort of saying, okay, here's MIT or Apache or BSD or some very, very permissive open source license, not necessarily copyleft intense like GPL or AGPL or something, but something more permissive, like a middle ground of open source rights like MIT or Apache, and they just put that on the Hugging Face card repo or the GitHub repo and call it a day.
Right.
That's actually not applied to the weights. It's applied to the PyTorch model that you wrote in Python, and it's applied to some scaffolding and some serialization things and whatever. Yep. It is not applied to the weights that get computed after you train the model and you generate that and you put it up there. It's not. And we're entering a domain that is unchartered and is reviving the church Turing thesis that computation can be found in many forms of substrate modality. And people do not yet have the critical thought applied in the domain of how do we actually permissively license this new computational paradigm that is, sort of utilizing neural networking based, computing principles. It's a very interesting kind of conversation.
Right. I wonder, there's something that you had mentioned in the kind of the bit torrenting of the thing that kind of launches into another whole line of kind of reasoning that I've been trying to do recently. And I wonder if sort of how you think about this. So, I've been, I don't know if you know, but I've been sort of obsessed with this Nostr stuff and sort of
me too.
React to that. Okay. And did you run into Nostrocket yet?
No. Wait, yes.
This is brand new.
The other day. Yes. Yeah. It's like an open source sustainability funding thing, right?
Yeah. So it's kind of.
I read the page.
Yeah, it's very raw. I think I just saw it yesterday or something, and we actually talked about it
was yesterday.
On the news thing that I haven't even published yet. It's probably going to publish it after this. But the idea of effectively like creating a share of something so that you can either get like future value on it, or you can get sats today, which are like just basically like payment, right? And once you start doing something with a share, something with future value, you start to wonder around like how would that future value be captured? And it's kind of a broader question around, I mean, I've asked, my friend Max Webster, who runs a Bitcoin-centric venture capital firm. It's kind of similar questions, which are like, I mean, we can all be excited about open source. And historically, we've seen some models of value capture, but like, presumably that needs to change and evolve as like the software evolves and the licenses evolve, and even just like the way a business gets created and the way value gets created and captured evolves. So, I wonder like a little bit broadly, but how do you see those changes in value capture? Because as an allocator, you need to both like find this thing in the future, and then you need to know how to sort of help it and nurture it, but then how to where are the parts that like value just is going to end up being captured, and how do you sort of play? It seems like a little bit of a dance, right?
Oh boy, you're going all the way.
Getting friend. Too spicy.
No, I've tweeted about this in the past, and you know what? I'm going to be completely unfiltered for you today, and just give you the straight up, raw, directly from the Unix sockets of my brain.
Yeah.
Unfiltered. I don't think anything in the world has any actual intrinsic value except life itself, and that includes Bitcoin. Period. That belief is very unevenly distributed. I think it's like me and like maybe a couple thousand people believe that. In terms of like, that's ground truth fact.
I wonder the idea. I don't want to.
That's physics.
Well, it's not pure physics. There's physics involved in it, but I wonder like how do you come to the conclusion that life is the thing?
Yes. I'm going to go back to Yuval Noah Harari for a second. Okay. Yuval has written about this. I don't remember which passage, chapter, book it comes from, but he's recited it a lot, and I believe it's actually very true. The only way and mechanism in which value accrues in our reality is by telling each other stories and getting more and more of our collective, human, group to believe said stories.
Yep. Is this the fictions part?
Yeah.
Of Harari? Yeah.
Yeah. That's basically it. In the beginning, shells were the representation of value. A little later on, paper currency was the representation of value. A little past that, we had products and services and markets. And then maybe past that, we had things like, the industrial age. And then now we're starting to imbue strings of numbers and hashes with value.
Mm-hmm.
That's a little freaking weird. Okay. Hashes and strings of numbers have value. Really? Okay. So, none of those things are true. Those are all lies. I like to say, I've tweeted this a few times. This is really controversial stuff. I'm finally getting a chance to not a chance. You're the beneficiary. You're just the guy that to randomly catch me on a day conversation. The biggest lie, and by biggest, I'm referring to the measure and quantum of qualitative, sort of stuff that you can attach to that abstract word, big, and then lie, meaning more in a binary sense. It's just factually untrue. In the technology industry, is that proprietary software has any value. Why is it big? Today, the whole software industry, technology industry, is worth about $5 trillion.
Mm-hmm.
About $1 trillion of that is just software spend. Mm-hmm. Just software spend. Mm-hmm. Software. Every year. These are numbers from Gartner and Forrester, by the way. You can go fact check me.
Sure.
$1,000 billion, $1 trillion every year. Companies, mostly companies, enterprises, spend on software that is proprietary. And the mechanism to purchase that is through a software license, proprietary software license. That's $1 trillion in basically lies that are interchanged between companies and other companies, i.e. humans and other humans, through all these abstractions we've created.
Yep.
By the way, the abstraction called the corporation is another thing that is essentially a lie that Yuval points to as well. Yep. It's a useful lie. It's a useful abstraction that allows us to coordinate trade and things more efficiently. But it's a lie. But it's a lie. Factually, it's a lie. And that's my philosophy. So I believe over a long enough period of time, open source does in fact, I don't really love this term eat, but I use it a lot. And so I'm probably just going to continue using it. Open source eats everything, literally everything. Mm-hmm. It'll eat all of software. It'll eat all of hardware. It'll eat all of industries and all kinds of places.
Yep.
It's going to take many, 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 many decades. Honestly, maybe a century or so, something like that. The most near-term thing that I can tell is not batshit crazy level aggressive risk to actually convince institutions and wealthy people to give me money to manage, to capital allocate it, as you said, which is what I do for my job, is open source eating software. Open source is eating software faster than software is eating the world. This guy, Mark Andreessen, who I think is super brilliant and has made a lot of contributions, but I think is a really toxic person. I will say that publicly. I think this is the first time I've said that publicly. I've never tweeted that. But when you publish this, I will not ask you to edit it out. You can keep this part in here. And I've met him, and he has a really useful narrative to draft off of. And it also happens to be a correct narrative, which is that software is eating the world. You wrote a New York Times op-ed, I think in 2008 or 2009, I can't remember exactly when. So it popularized this idea that software is transforming all these industries, agriculture and health and biology and transportation and hospitality and all these different industries are getting transformed by software. Right. What he really didn't emphasize or highlight is that it was largely getting transformed by proprietary software, not open source software, but proprietary software. So Facebook and Airbnb and Twitter and so on and so forth.
Yep.
Ad infinitum. What is interesting to me, and I think is actually more profound, is the area under the curve of open source eating software itself is expanding more rapidly than the area under the curve of software eating everything. Because the area under the curve of software eating everything is already pretty freaking gargantuan. It's huge.
Yep.
It's like this. It's like a huge ass wave.
So just from law of large numbers, we're already well recognized on that trend.
$10 trillion. $10 trillion of software eating a lot of industries has already been materialized in terms of market cap, measurable value capture over the last 30 years or so. Frankly, 40 or 50 years if we're counting when Oracle was founded and when Microsoft was founded.
Right.
40 or 50 years. Open source eating software is younger, more vibrant, more interesting, and a lot smaller. It's a lot smaller. Okay. So open source eating software today, by my measure, and I maniacally measure this, so I think I'm right. I could be off by a little few percentages, but I think I'm pretty accurate here, is less than $500 billion.
And that's like revenue turnover, is that?
Not counting crypto. Not counting crypto.
But the 500 billion, is that's revenue of the companies that...
I'll unpack it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'll unpack it. It's counting the aggregate market cap of about 1,000 companies that are commercial open source companies. I call them cost companies. People call them open core companies. People who are less linguistically obsessed with precision call them open source companies. I think that term is oxymoronic because it's impossible to open source a company unless you share the bank statements of the company with everyone. No company does that. And even if you did that, the company technically isn't open source because we don't have a license to go and say, apply this license to your company and now you are technically open source. Like a C++ program licensed under MIT is different than a proprietary C++ program. Right. That doesn't work. But I'm overly pedantic and weird. So let's just call them open source companies to make things simple.
Okay.
$500 billion, $100 billion of public companies, $400 billion of private companies. Frankly, the $400 billion is probably overvalued because of all the insane valuations that happened in the last 5 years in particular. So let's cut it in half. Let's do a markdown of 200 billion, shall we? Okay. So it's 200 billion in the private markets and call it, you know what? Actually, it's probably more like 60 billion in the public markets. So 260 billion. It's a very small category. Right. But the interesting thing is, this was a $10 billion category a decade ago. Decade and change ago. It grew by 26 times at a minimum, maybe 50 times in the last decade. And there's been 30 IPOs of open source companies, cost companies. Again, let's get past the linguistics here and semantics. Of companies that didn't even exist roughly a decade ago. Mongo, GitLab, HashiCorp, Confluent, Cloudera, Hortonworks, all those happened in the last 5 or 6 years. It's pretty crazy. So, the interesting thing that I see is open source is eating software faster than software is eating the world. It's happening mostly at the infrastructure software level, which is like developer tools, databases, middleware, lower levels of the stack. At OSS Capital, I've invested in open source alternatives to applications, which I think are very interesting as well. So that's higher up the stack. Those are applications. Yep. And for example, we've invested in open source alternatives. I call them transformers because alternative is a bit of a diminutive, sort of almost kind of pejorative or a dismissive characterization. Right. These companies can transform the existing categories to things like Notion, Airtable, Bloomberg Terminal, the Unreal Engine from Epic or Unity, Calendly, a long list. These are applications. These aren't like dev tools or like lower level, things. And they're actually making a lot of progress. These communities are growing really quickly, and there's a huge groundswelling of developer interest. And that developer interest, you can translate it into, the sort of like physics that allows you to sort of almost, kind of gravitate the technology in the right areas of the industry to where you can have the absolute lowest customer acquisition cost and transform markets unbelievably efficiently. I believe these companies have raised and have actually been overfunded by VCs to the tune of probably a factor of 3 or 4 more than they should have raised.
You're saying the open source software companies have been overfunded?
Yes. Yes. Because I've been pretty loud about it. And I think I've contributed to some of that. But I'm a small player and I'm just like one person. But there's been $30 billion in venture capital invested in commercial open source companies in the last 3 years. I started OSS Capital 5 years ago. In the last 3 years.
The commercial open
95% of the money I've invested in open source companies since the founding of Red Hat in the early 90s.
Right.
The majority of it has happened in the last 3 years.
So
they're overfunded.
You've mentioned a bunch of these application layer companies
One last thing, David. When I said not including crypto, when I was sizing what is the value capture of open source eating software faster than software is eating the world.
Yeah.
If we take 250 billion of the software companies, like I mentioned, public and private, and then we add in the total market cap of all of the layer 1 token cryptos like Cardano and Ethereum and Bitcoin and Solana and all the other ones, some of which I think are more open source than others, by the way. We can have that conversation. That's a separate conversation. It's actually quite nuanced. It's about today, $600 billion, $550 to $600 billion, because prices are very compressed. Actually, it's maybe close to $1 trillion. No, sorry, I'm a little off. It's about $1 trillion.
That's market cap of all of.
Yes, that's the market cap of all of the open sources eating software faster than software is eating the world. But it's not quite software, because remember, one person responded to my tweet of what should be open source but isn't yet with money. Open source can, in fact, actually eat money, but money wasn't previously a software product like Oracle, where you're disrupting Oracle with Mongo database or with Cassandra or with MySQL. Right? Money is a figment of our imagination. Wow. Okay. That's a bit of a bigger thing. It's a little bigger. We're talking about tens of trillions of dollars in terms of, the aggregate value of what we constitute and what we consider to be money. And if you look at the derivatives market, maybe it's in the high tens of trillions, or maybe even north of $100 trillion. But it's not software. It's just another story we've told ourselves about what is the abstraction in which we can imbue value. Used to be shells, used to be paper currencies, used to be, these other things, and now it's a hash.
So you've mentioned money now a couple times. You mentioned Bitcoin, and I'm curious what your take is on that. Like, do you see Bitcoin as the new open source money, or do you think there's some flaws that issues you would take with?
I think there's a ton of flaws with Bitcoin. I think the paper is interesting and the algorithms are interesting. I think there are enormous improvements to be made. Satoshi said publicly that things like smart contracts are interesting and that either would require a new additional system or could be built on top of the Bitcoin framework and code base itself very early on. This is in 2010, 2011, way before Vitalik wrote the first lines of code for Ethereum, way before. I think that something like so my explicit answer to your question is I think something like Bitcoin or Ethereum will become the dominant form of money over the next 50 years for all of humans.
And when you say do you mean you expect some of these improvements and you expect something new to emerge here, or you think that these existing systems may get upgraded in one way or another to support such a belief?
Both.
But do you believe there are going to be multiple new monies, or do you believe there will be one new money?
Yes.
And is that a yes? You believe there are multiple?
I believe all of the things that you just said are true, and they can be true at the same time.
How does that work? I don't understand how that works.
With varying degrees of success. Here's the thing about change. The world is extremely heterogeneous and evolutionary. And any questions like this that come from, and I know you're not asking it like this because you're very smart, the industry, the narrative, the broader kind of hive mind that is the internet and all these different communities like Web3 and all the divisiveness and politics. When people ask, what is the one? Is it this one? Is it that one? The answer is all of the above, because the world is so huge. And I think in the future, there's going to be a plurality and many digital currencies. I do not think there will ever be one true. So frankly, as much as I love Jack Dorsey, I love the guy, he is wrong. Bitcoin is not the one true gospel currency. Frankly, there is a huge amount of money to be made taking that point of view, and you will succeed, I think.
You think taking the point of view that there's going to be some plurality?
No, taking Jack's point of view.
Okay.
Or taking, the CEO of MicroStrategy.
Michael Saylor.
Who used to be, a physicist and a rocket scientist at MIT and was an enterprise software guy for a long time, building business intelligence software.
Yep.
Got into crypto. Michael and Jack and others who have the diamond eyes, laser eyes, whatever is it? Laser eyes.
Yep. Laser eyes, diamond hands.
Diamond hands. What other body parts can we purpose for crypto? I guess my point of view is in the future, there's going to be probably many very successful digital currencies with cryptographic guarantees and properties similar to Ethereum and Bitcoin. But I've written a little bit about this in the past. I don't actually see the primitives today that will allow the $100+ trillion of existing fiat infrastructure to gradually migrate in a sort of let's meet the people where they are today and incrementally allow for change, as opposed to, are you coming on this train or not? And you need to leave everything behind. Right. And you know what? You're crazy if you don't. That is not realistic. I'm sorry.
But could it be that the foundations that exist today could be upgraded?
No. Yes. But the reason free software frankly failed and would not have ushered in the success we see is because it needed to be more pragmatic and approachable. And that's why a group of very smart people said, we need to rebrand this and call it open source and retain the core principles, the four freedoms, which are like physics fundamental level principles.
Yeah.
But make it more accessible for people, make it more approachable for people. We do not have that today with crypto. Full stop, period. We do not. Period. I'm sorry. By the way, I'm like a huge fan. I'm a massive fan. I'm a holder. I've got a bunch of wallets. I've got a bunch of API tools. I play with the software a lot. We are so far from anything even remotely coming close to mainstream. Not even close.
Do you think the way to get it mainstream is to build something new that's more accessible versus upgrading the existing stuff?
Yes, probably both. Probably we can upgrade and do a lot of good change, but here's the problem: there's so much like deeply rooted ideological friction preventing Ethereum and Bitcoin, those two projects specifically, from materializing the right set of pragmatic abstractions that will allow the current inertia-full industry and ecosystem of fiat to move in a gradual way. I forget who said this, but evolution, not revolution, is better to make massive change in certain areas. Sometimes you need the revolution. Sometimes you need to rip the Band-Aid off and like do hardcore shit. But like in this case, because of the lie we've been telling for centuries on end about fiat, so much inertia and so much deeply intertwined stuff across every possible part of our society and the tech industry and all these other things. We need an evolutionary path forward. Ethereum and Bitcoin are not the answer, unfortunately. They could be if they got refactored in a big way. But here's the big thing, honestly. It's not even a technology issue. It's the ideology of both of those ecosystems holding it back. And I find it frustrating.
So if you were...
I want both of them to win. I'm not making a criticism of this is the way it is and we can't fix it. I want both of them to win. I'm a huge fan. Do not misinterpret me. But the reality, I'm telling you, like fact, is the ideological friction is what's holding it back. That's it.
And do you think that the ideological friction is a feature that will never evolve? Like, do you feel like it's been consistent the last, say, 10, 14 years?
Yeah. I think it's possible to change. It's just really hard. I mean, it would be really, really hard. Imagine how many people you'd have to convince. Also, I was at ETH Denver very briefly a couple weeks back. ETH Denver is a 25,000 person conference. I founded KubeCon. Today, KubeCon is a 25,000 person conference. Okay? KubeCon was the first Kubernetes community conference. I was very lucky to attach myself to Kubernetes. I didn't scale KubeCon. It was donated to the Linux Foundation, and the Linux Foundation did an unbelievably phenomenal job. And credit to Chris Anichek, my friend there, and Jim Zemlin, and others who are unbelievably incredible people. And they did all the work. But I came up with the idea, and I branded it, and I organized the first two events. By the way, Kubernetes and Ethereum are a year apart. Kubernetes was founded in June 2014, and Ethereum came out exactly a year later, something like that. A year apart. They're basically founded around the same time frame. If you get 20 different Ethereum people, experts, respected, maybe even Vitalik, and a bunch of others in a room, and you ask them what their definition of Ethereum is, you're going to get 20 different answers. And then here's the other thing. You're going to get like 20 different answers on a spectrum of philosophical intensity and ideological intensity, right? That's the problem. That's the problem.
So you're saying there's no consensus.
That's what I'm saying.
And so in a sense, then it sounds like it's not a concern about the accessibility as much as it's a concern about consensus being the core.
I don't think we need consensus to make evolutionary change possible. But the fact that we have zero consensus is a problem.
Got it. So, moving away from kind of purely the cryptocurrency stuff, I mentioned Nostr, and you said that you're also a big fan. And I've
massive fan of Nostr.
Yeah,
massive. Fan of Nostr.
I wonder, what is it about Nostr that really grabs you?
The big thing that Nostr does for me is it inverts the conventional client-server paradigm, and it gives the client the full control that the server used to have. That is profound and fucking awesome. And it's going to change everything if it works. And it is as interesting. This is a great segue, David. It is as interesting. I'm going to go as far as saying this as the creation of Bitcoin.
I agree.
It is as interesting. Okay? That is like, whoa, that's a big deal. Holy shit. Everybody needs to pay attention.
I agree.
Everybody needs to pay attention. Okay? I believe it's that big of a deal. I spent probably the upwards of 10 hours in the early days of Nostr wrapping my mind around it and talking to people and, talking with Naval a lot about it and just... This is profound stuff. Imagine a world on the internet where you only had one username and it was secure and you didn't have to go and switch between 50 different apps and get your data locked in and all this. I mean, oh my God, this is nirvana. And it here's the beautiful thing. It allows for evolutionary change, not revolutionary change. So you can slot it into the existing architecture of the internet without needing to go and say, please rewrite your application on Ethereum using our smart contract, ERC 49532, and you'll need to have this particular tool chain, and your gas fees are going to be cost prohibitive, but just trust us, it's going to work out, okay? I'm sorry, that's untenable for 99.999% of internet services, small and large. VCs don't seem to care, by the way. They plowed $75 billion into Web3 companies. They don't seem to care. How's that working out for you so far? I'm waiting. $75 billion is a lot of cash. That's, I think, roughly the amount that VCs have invested in all crypto companies since inception. So, yeah, I think Nostr is profound and very, very, very exciting.
Right. Is it an ecosystem that you already have beliefs around how you might invest within kind of an open source perspective?
I already have.
What does that look like?
I can't talk about a couple I've made that are undisclosed, but 3 of our portfolio companies that we have already invested in have already started to make very significant progress integrating Nostr into their services and into their open source applications. One I can mention publicly is Umbrel, Umbrel, which is a self-hosted, self-sovereign sort of data management system and lets you run all of your personal data and all of your personal information on like a Raspberry Pi type device or a small server. And they actually integrated Nostr so that when you boot up a Pi, it starts its own Nostr relay. And it's really cool. It actually works really well. So that's one. I invested and led the first seed round of Umbrel almost 2 years ago. And they're doing really well. The other one is Space Drive, which is a virtual distributed file system.
I haven't seen that. How does that work?
It's based on a paper that came out of UC Berkeley, proposing a virtual distributed file system that basically allows you to access files over a kind of virtual file discovery network. And it's kind of like Dropbox, but agnostic to where you store the files. So
does it take a similar approach that Nostr does with the relays, or is there some other kind of architecture that it approaches?
I think it does, but they're integrating it in a few other ways. I can't talk intelligently about it, unfortunately, but they're huge fans of Nostr.
Yeah, because I think the media hosting on Nostr is kind of an open question. There's one that's pretty common called Nostr.build, and a lot of it is kind of free for now, but you could imagine that there could be a lot of different media hosting services that help serve that. I think it's mostly not going to be a feature of the relays.
I could definitely see.
So, maybe that's why I'm curious to learn more about that. Maybe we can do it in a follow-up, but I'm curious I think we know a bit about relays and there's like fast evolving ecosystem, and we know a lot about clients. That's a fast evolving ecosystem, but like what should a media server look like? And are there going to be like, thousands of them? And is that going to be a very decentralized thing? And how did like the middleware pieces, I think media servers like the first obvious one.
Yeah. No, I mean, frankly, you can look at anything and Nostrify it, probably.
Right. Is there anything that you think? Is there anything that you think is like ripe to be done now in Nostr that nobody's really approaching yet, or like what would you sort of, if you wanted to say request for startups? Do you have sort of a favorite concept?
I think Nostr is going to be hard to invest in directly, I'm considering donating to it, but I think it already has a lot of donation support. And Jack donated 14 Bitcoin early on, like a few $100,000, and it's been a bunch of other pylons. Maybe I should donate, some of our capital to the Nostr community. But like, I tend to think Nostr is like a protocol, like kind of like SMTP or HTTP.
Yeah, sure.
It's like a fundamental protocol.
It definitely is, yeah.
And you can't really invest in it directly because it's not, a startup. It's not a company. It's not a database or anything.
Right.
But it will be integrated and adopted by developers widely and become a very dominant part of the tool chain for how you build, frankly, truly distributed and decentralized applications.
Yep.
Without a token.
Yeah. 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 I look at it more as
like a blockchain without a token.
But it's actually, it doesn't have the features of a blockchain, right? Like
No, I'm familiar with that.
Okay.
It doesn't have Merkle trees aren't in there. You don't have cryptographic guarantees. I understand all of that. Yeah. It's not a distributed ledger. But it does give you, without being a peer-to-peer network itself, it does give you elements of decentralization and really, frankly, some of the most critical and, sort of like evolutionary and accessible elements of how you build a decentralized system effectively without all the baggage of rewrite your app on Ethereum, please. Right? Which I find extremely exciting. And it goes back to a lot of the conversations we had in this chat. Evolution is vastly superior to revolution as an approach if you want to make massive scale change happen in a pragmatic way. And that's why I'm such a big fan of Nostr.
Yeah. I sort of take, I mean, I think I feel the same kind of instinct that you offer here, but I would say it a little bit differently, which is, I think you need a revolutionary new foundation, but you could do evolutionary things on top of that revolutionary foundation. So in order to attract and support a normie, some user who doesn't really care about the technology, I think you need to meet people where they are. But if you meet people where they are and you just have a login and password with an email and blah, 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 it's like, you haven't really won anything. So I'm excited about the new foundation, and then let's build all kinds of things that make it easy to use and then doesn't really compromise on the principles underlying it.
Yeah, totally. I agree. That's a really good way of saying it.
Cool. I noticed, I know that the, Fiat Joff and Will Kassaran from, the developer behind Damus, they're probably the most talked about kind of thinkers in the space of builders in Nostr, let's say. And they both, came from working on Bitcoin Core at one point in the past. And so there's a bit of a Bitcoin ethos to the development working in Nostr.
Yeah. And I think that could be, by the way, I think that could be a problem.
I was going to ask you about that because it sounds like you're more bought into Nostr, less convinced on Bitcoin. And I wonder sort of
There's two problems with Nostr today. One is its ideological connectivity or tentacles back to Bitcoin, just like you articulated. Fiat Jaff and Will from Damus, the most widely adopted Nostr client. By the way, the puns in this community are fucking Nostradamus, Nostril. There's a client called Nostril, I think.
Yeah.
It's just fantastic.
Kian built a relay called Booger because
endless amounts of fun. I love it.
Yeah.
That's a problem. Why is it a problem? Because Nostr needs to be its own thing. It needs to stand on its own legs, and it shouldn't be like, hey, we're part of this other community. Build your own community. That's one problem. The other problem is technical. It's more technical. I think the specification of the design is too tightly tailored to wanting to be a Twitter alternative, and it should be more general. It should be more application agnostic, which, by the way, we're kind of already seeing in a lot of the clients. I mean, Jack has been banging on Damus for a GitHub alternative, right? And he put a bounty out, and one of our founders actually built the first implementation. This guy Pierre Richardson, who lives in the Canary Islands. He's
cool,
amazing founder. He's the founder of Cal.com, by the way. Huge shout out to Pierre. Pierre is amazing. I love Pierre very much, and his startup Cal.com is an open source alternative to Calendly, which is a calendar scheduling app. They're doing extremely well. We love their seed round. Alexis Ohanian, the founder of Reddit, did the Series A. They're doing great. I would say that's a problem, right? Don't tie Nostr to Twitter too much. Like, let's kill Twitter. Let's do open source alternative to Twitter, decentralized Twitter. Like, no. Nostr is a general, fundamental notes and other stuff transmitted over relays for, I would say, data and other stuff transmitted over relays. Duster, notes implies kind of pigeonholing it to the Twitter.
It's just a note is just like a carrier. It's just a box that carries data.
Yes, right? But it's that term notes is, I think, too narrow. It should be just data, any data.
Okay.
I think. But that breaks the pun, so we can't change it. That's great. So the name, we can't change the name. The name is too good. So I think it's too tied to Twitter, because, like, let's say you wanted to build a Nostr-based Google or email, right, or Dropbox or, Zoom or, whatever. Like, build all software using this new client-server paradigm. It's a fundamentally new client-server paradigm. That should be the slogan.
But isn't that what we're doing? Like, it just turns out that the Twitter cloning is like a easy, obvious first use case.
It's too cute. It's just too cute. It's too cute. It's like, there's this like Bitcoin community connection point, and then there's the Twitter thing, and Jack's like the big voice, and he created Twitter, and it's too cute. I think maybe slightly holding it back from being more generally awesome, and I think opening up a chance for someone else to come in and say, here's a better Nostr that is basically the same idea. It's called something else. It's not trying to play on puns. Maybe Google releases something like that, like gRPC, like fundamental, right? You came from Google, so you know what gRPC is. Something more general purpose. It's not tied to any particular application. Because it's right now people are having fun and it's cute. And I think that that's cool. It looks like a toy and it's interesting. And it could be the thing. It could be the dominant thing. But I also think it could potentially be good that it's like Jack waving this flag after having created Twitter, after having scaled the company, and he still has his Twitter stake, by the way, after Elon bought it. Jack maintained a pretty big Twitter stake. So Jack is not out of Twitter. Most people don't quite fully realize this. He has not sold his entire Twitter stake.
But what is the implication there?
The implication is actually quite interesting. If Elon actually does turn around Twitter, which everyone thinks it's going straight into the ground, but if Elon does turn around Twitter, and Elon, I think people kind of fail to remember this. Elon kind of has a good track record turning shit around. He kind of has a good track record doing that, like with cars and with rockets and with payments companies and a few other things. Like, he's not, some random person.
Okay, so it sounds like you're bullish on
I'm not
Twitter.
bullish.
Oh,
I'm not bullish.
Okay.
I'm saying people are too dismissive.
Right.
I'm not necessarily bullish. But I think people are too dismissive.
Okay. So, with Nostr, one of the big challenges is that relays incur a cost to operate. And there's storage, bandwidth.
Yeah. Run a server. Yeah.
And when it's small, it works as a hobbyist thing and curiosity and stuff.
Yeah.
But at some amount of scale, that doesn't work.
Yeah.
It needs to achieve some amount of scale to break in a sense. But when it breaks, how do you imagine that should get fixed?
I think there's a lot of different extrinsic incentive systems that can be designed and implemented to solve for that are either fiat or crypto, ideally both, ideally a spectrum of both at the same time, for the reasons we talked about earlier around evolutionary change as opposed to revolutionary binary change. And I also think that, quality of service guarantees for internet services is extreme. You worked at Google. This is extremely difficult stuff. It is incredibly complex to maintain 5 nines or 6 nines for a server. You want to maintain 1 9, not that hard. 2 nines, it's a little harder. 3 nines, okay, you're going to start getting paid.
Right.
4 nines, you're going to really start getting paid. 5 nines, you can really demand a boatload of money for 5 nines. 6 nines, now you're Google. 7 nines, you're definitely Google. Right? So I think reliability of internet services can be charged at a premium and can be made quite lucrative for the people who are able to do that. But again, I think Nostr presents such a profoundly interesting shift in the architecture of the internet as to basically open up a space of disintermediation for up-and-coming ISPs, essentially, and server operators to disaggregate quality of service away from Google and Facebook and all the big internet companies, and actually provide infrastructure alternatives that are potentially as appealing as open source is to closed source, but at the quality of service level on the internet. That's really exciting.
Yep.
That's really exciting.
Cool. I know we're getting near the end of the time we'd sort of allocated to hang out, but I wanted to get one last thing, which is a little bit,
Sure.
A little bit of like the philosophy of how these spaces could be invested in or should be invested in, and just because I think that's sort of your day to day is kind of on the investing and venture side in commercial open source. And so when we think about, you mentioned things like cal.com, which is a website that I presume is using open source software to operate it.
It's all open source. Yep.
And so is the model that we should look for going forward, and I don't know the model of how Cal works, but is it something, is like the automatic WordPress model the likely kind of evolutionary winner, and now we're going to just see that happen, dozens, hundreds of times?
Yes. I think we're going to see dozens or hundreds of automatics. Automatic is basically a $10 billion company. I think they can be a $20 billion company. We're going to see a lot of those. And they're going to be based on core open source technologies that they build products and services around for different types of customers. The most common business model is you have the open source core, and then you have customers who are like enterprises or individuals too. That's also very common. And you have these pain points and you're really annoyed and you're like, I wish it did this. I wish it did this. And you're like, those requirements, they're really convenience features and they make my life easier. They don't really necessarily need to be open source. I would love to pay for them. Build them, charge me money for that software. Make the software proprietary, no problem. That's a really great business model. Or you could take the software and offer it up as a cloud service on a Nostr-based network and monetize it that way and deliver a higher quality of service, a better experience, and people will pay you money for it. The core technology, 99% of the core technology, frankly, the whole thing is open source. So you can do whatever you want with it. You control the data. You can create the customizations you want. You're in control of the technology stack. That is sovereign computing at its best. And I do believe we're going to see, Automatic is really next generation Red Hat. Red Hat's kind of lost its way. It's got swallowed by IBM. There's a lot of messy stuff there. I think Automatic is next generation Red Hat. We're going to see 100 companies as big as Automatic in all parts of the stack. And I think we can already point to some of them. Grafana, HashiCorp, maybe Mongo, although they did this weird license change that was unnecessary, but they're still effectively open source. Like, we're going to see a huge number of companies like that. And I think it's going to make the world a lot better, and it's going to be really cool. And we're going to see probably an open source version of SpaceX, going back to your space travel example, David. Maybe it's going to be SpaceX. Who knows? I personally think I'll end with this. Personally think Elon thinks from first principles. In fact, I don't think that. I think I know he does. What do we really know, though, in life? We don't really know anything. So I think I know that he thinks from first principles. And in the world of bits, the way of thinking from first principles is called open source. In the world of atoms, the world of thinking from first principles is called physics. Okay? And I think Elon is such a huge physics nerd, and he realizes that open source is fundamental ground truth, the best way of building technology in the world of bits. Right? So I personally believe that he's going to open source a great deal of the stuff he's doing over time. It's probably going to take some time. But I'm hopeful and optimistic. I hope I'm right. I could be wrong, but I hope I'm right.
Well, good. Well, that's a great inspirational kind of future-looking message to deliver and to share. So thanks for sharing that.
It's my pleasure, and thank you for having me, David.
Yeah, thanks for coming.